The way she looked at him should have been a reason to have her removed. In a world where men lower their heads and seasoned soldiers tremble at the sound of his lighter, the new waitress was a glitch in Choi Tae-sung's perfect machine. He was used to the invisible staff, terrified silhouettes who dropped plates and averted their eyes to avoid his notice. But when Amina Johnson set the porcelain cup before him, her gaze didn't falter. It locked onto him with a steady, quiet defiance that felt like a challenge to his very existence. "Is the tea to your liking, Mr. Choi?" Her voice was steady, lacking the frantic quiver he had come to expect from everyone in Seoul. He didn't answer immediately. He searched her eyes for the flicker of fear, the reflexive retreat he saw in his enemies before they broke. Instead, he found a calm, iron-willed resolve. Something dormant and dangerous shifted in Tae-sung's chest, a sudden irrational need to see exactly how much pressure it would take to make her look away. For a man who controlled the city's shadows with a single word, being looked at as an equal by a girl in a uniform made him feel something he hadn't felt in decades. Intrigued. "Who told you that you could look at me?" he asked, his voice a low, melodic threat. Amina didn't blink. "Respect is seen, sir," she replied, and the air in the restaurant seemed to vanish. Amina had worked at the restaurant for 3 weeks, and she knew the hierarchy. She knew that Daniel Park and Yuna treated table 4 like a sacrificial altar. She knew the scent of Tae-sung's expensive cologne was a warning to stay back. She understood the rules of the world. Be silent, be efficient, be invisible. But Amina Johnson had spent 24 years being the other. The foreigner, the outsider, the girl who had to work twice as hard for half the respect. She had learned that once you start bowing, people never let you stand back up. Today, her courage was a necessity, not a choice. Her manager, Sung-ho, had tried to dock her pay for a broken glass she hadn't touched, and the debt collectors back in Louisiana were calling her sister again. She couldn't afford to be the girl who fumbled a tray or looked at the floor in shame. She needed this job to be her fortress. If she let the fear in the room swallow her, she'd lose the only thing she had left, her dignity. She had smoothed her apron, tucked a stray lock of hair into her bun, and walked toward the most dangerous man in South Korea because the rent was due. Her family was waiting, and she refused to let a boss see her sweat. She had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of being unshakable, but as Tae-sung leaned forward, she realized that being noticed by a predator was a lot more dangerous than being invisible. The silence in the restaurant was so thick it felt like a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of every server in the room. Behind the mahogany partition, Daniel Park gripped a serving tray so hard his knuckles turned white, his eyes darting toward the floor. Yuna had suddenly found a reason to reorganize a perfectly straight row of wine glasses, her breath coming in shallow hitches. To them, table 4 wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a storm front, and Choi Tae-sung was the lightning. Amina felt the heat of their collective panic, but she didn't let it infect her. She moved with a rhythmic grace, her sensible black shoes making no sound on the polished hardwood. As she reached the table, the air temperature seemed to drop. Tae-sung sat perfectly still, a man carved from obsidian and tailored silk. He didn't look up as she placed the hand-carved stone coaster down, followed by the delicate porcelain cup of steaming omija tea. The golden rule of the restaurant was simple: serve the shadow, never the man. You look at the cuff of his sleeve, the knot of his tie, or the steam rising from the cup, but you never, under any circumstances, look at the face. Amina ignored it. As she finished the pour, she didn't retreat into the shadows like the others. She stood her ground, her hands moving to her back in a formal clasp, and waited. When Tae-sung finally lifted his head, expecting the crown of a bowed head or the sight of a trembling chin, he was met with the deep, steady brown of Amina's eyes. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. In the background, a glass slipped from Yuna's hand, shattering against the tile with a sound like a gunshot. No one moved to clean it. Every eye was fixed on the standoff. Tae-sung's expression didn't change, but his pupils dilated, tracking the lack of fear in her face. He had spent his life navigating rooms where people either wanted to kill him or were terrified he would kill them. Amina looked at him as if he were simply a man who had ordered tea. "Your tea, sir," she said, the words low and melodic. Tae-sung leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking, a sound that seemed to echo in the dead quiet room. His iron-controlled gaze narrowed, searching for the crack in her armor, the hidden tremor that would betray her. He found nothing but a resolute, professional dignity. "You're new," he observed. It wasn't a question. It was an indictment. 3 weeks, Mr. Choi, she replied. She didn't answer this time, and the omission felt like a spark hitting dry tinder. He picked up the cup, the steam curling around his sharp features, but his eyes never left hers. Around them, the restaurant's hierarchy began to crumble. The power dynamic that had kept the staff in a state of subservient paralysis for years had been punctured by a single look. Tae-sung took a slow sip. His gaze locked on Amina, signaling to everyone in the room that the invisible girl was now the only thing in the world he intended to see. In the days that followed, the atmosphere of the restaurant shifted from a cold chill to a static charge that hummed whenever the front doors opened. Choi Tae-sung did not merely return. He established a residency. Every evening at precisely 7 o'clock, he occupied the same table in Amina's section, a silent sentinel in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He didn't bring associates, and he didn't bring weapons, at least none that were visible. He brought only his presence, which acted like a spotlight that followed Amina's every move. The other staff watched from the periphery, whispering in the kitchen like frightened birds. But for Amina, the pressure didn't come from the mafia boss. It came from Sung-ho, the floor manager whose ego had been bruised by Amina's sudden importance. Sung-ho was a man who thrived on the smallness of others, and seeing Tae-sung's eyes fixated on the new waitress made him venomous. Table 6 asked for more water 3 minutes ago, Amina. Are you on a lunch break? Sung-ho's voice was a low hiss near her ear as she reached for a fresh linen. He didn't wait for her to answer, his hand darting out to snatch the cloth from her grip. You think because a man like that looks at you, you are special? To him you are just a curiosity. To me, you are a slow waitress who is replaceable. From his table, Tae-sung watched the interaction. He didn't move a muscle, his hand wrapped around a glass of neat whiskey, but his gaze was predatory. He saw the way Sung-ho crowded Amina's personal space, the way his finger jabbed toward her chest to emphasize a point, and the way Amina's jaw tightened as she forced herself to remain professional. He saw her swallow her pride, not out of fear of Sung-ho, but out of the desperate need to keep the small plastic card in her pocket, the one that allowed her to send money back to Louisiana. Later that night, as the dinner rush peaked, Sung-ho intentionally tripped the pace. He redirected the busboys away from Amina's tables, leaving her to clear heavy trays while balancing new orders. When a drop of sauce splashed onto the white tablecloth of an adjacent table, Sung-ho was there in an instant. Incompetent, Sung-ho barked, loud enough for the surrounding patrons to turn. Clean it. On your knees if you have to. Just get it off my floor. Mina froze. The hum of the restaurant died. She looked at the floor, then at the cloth in her hand, the weight of her immigrant struggle pressing against her ribs like a physical ache. She began to lower herself, the art of invisibility her only remaining shield. But before her knee could touch the wood, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor cut through the room like a blade. Sung stood up. He didn't look at the mess, and he didn't look at Amina. He turned his unreadable, iron-cold gaze toward Sung-ho. The manager's face went from a triumphant red to a sickly, translucent white in a matter of seconds. Tae-sung didn't say a word. He simply set his glass down on the table with a finality that signaled the end of the manager's authority. In that silence, Amina realized she was no longer being watched. She was being guarded. The humid Seoul night clung to Amina like a second skin as she stepped out of the restaurant's service entrance. Her shift had ended an hour late, and the weight of Sung-ho's harassment felt like lead in her shoes. She adjusted the strap of her bag, her mind already calculating the exchange rate for the money she needed to wire to Louisiana. She was so focused on the math of survival that she didn't notice the black sedan idling at the mouth of the alley, its headlights extinguished. A shadow detached itself from the brickwork. Then another. Amina Johnson, a voice rasped, speaking English with a thick, jagged accent. It was Park, a mid-level enforcer for the predatory lending ring that had tracked her family's debt across an ocean. He was a man who smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne. His presence a violent stain on the quiet street. "Your sister says the well is dry. We think you're just hiding the bucket." Amina's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't scream. She had learned early that screaming only gave men like Park more satisfaction. "I told you I get paid on Friday. You'll have the interest then." "Friday is too long," Park sneered, stepping into the dim yellow glow of a street lamp. He reached out, his thick fingers aiming for the strap of her bag. Amina flinched, her back hitting the cold brick of the alleyway. She was alone, thousands of miles from home, cornered by a ghost from her past. She braced for the impact, for the familiar rough handling of a world that didn't care about her dignity. But the blow never came. Instead, the sound of a car door closing echoed through the alley. Not the sedan, but a heavy, armored door. Two men appeared from the darkness behind Park. They didn't look like street thugs. They looked like shadows in suits, moving with a synchronized lethal efficiency that made Park's aggression look like a child's tantrum. One of them, a man Amina recognized as Tae-sung's personal driver, stepped into the light. He didn't say a word to Amina. He didn't even look at her. He simply caught Park's wrist in a grip that made the loan shark's face turn a bruised shade of purple. "You are standing in the wrong place," the driver said. His voice a low, terrifying hum. Park's bravado vanished instantly. He knew these suits. He knew the crest on their lapels. I didn't know she was under the dragon's shadow. I was just." "You were leaving," the driver interrupted. In seconds the alley was empty. The loan sharks scrambled into their sedan and tore away, leaving Amina trembling against the wall. The driver turned to her then, his face an unreadable mask of professional courtesy. He opened the rear door of a waiting black limousine, revealing the dim, amber-lit interior. Inside, shrouded in the scent of bergamot and expensive whiskey, sat Choi Tae-sung. He didn't offer a hand, and he didn't offer an apology. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the neon lights of the city. Amina realized with a jolt of terror that the invisible life she had fought so hard to maintain was gone. She wasn't being hunted by the dark anymore. She had been claimed by it. The heavy door of the limousine clicked shut, sealing out the damp Seoul night and replacing it with a hum of climate-controlled silence. Amina sat on the edge of the leather bench, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles mirrored the ivory of the fine porcelain she served daily. Beside her, Choi Tae-sung remained a shadow among shadows, the amber light of the car's console carving his profile into sharp, unforgiving lines. "Drink?" he asked, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and resonate directly in her chest. He didn't wait for an answer, pouring a finger of amber liquid into a crystal glass that caught the passing streetlights. He held it out not to a waitress but to a guest. Amina didn't take it. She forced herself to meet his eyes, her chin tilted up in that same quiet defiance that had first caught his attention. "I don't belong in this car, Mr. Choi. And I don't need a protector. I just need to get home." Tae-sung set the glass down with a rhythmic thud against the wood-grain tray. "You belong wherever you choose to stand, Amina. But you cannot stand against men like Park with nothing but a professional stare." He leaned forward, the scent of bergamot and expensive tobacco surrounding her. "I know why you are here. I know about the house on the edge of the bayou in Louisiana. I know about the sister who is trying to keep your mother's medical bills from drowning the family, and the loan you took from the wrong people to get your visa." The blood drained from Amina's face. The invisibility she had cultivated for 24 years felt like a threadbare sheet being ripped away. To have her secrets spoken aloud in the back of a car in South Korea by a man who moved mountains with a whisper was more terrifying than the loan sharks had ever been. "How do you know that?" she whispered, her voice finally betraying a flicker of the fear he had been searching for. "Because I make it my business to know the value of everything in my sight," Tae-sung replied. He didn't look triumphant. He looked almost weary, like a king burdened by the weight of his own surveillance. You have been sending 70% of your paycheck home. You have been eating one meal a day to ensure your sister has enough for the pharmacy. You are a woman of immense discipline, Amina. But you are fighting a war with a kitchen knife. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, heavy envelope, placing it on the seat between them. The debt in Louisiana no longer exists. I have purchased it. Amina stared at the envelope as if it were a coiled viper. I didn't ask you for this. I don't want to owe you, of all people. You don't owe me money, Taesung said, his gaze softening just enough to be dangerous. I simply prefer my guests to sit at my table without the weight of the world bowing their heads. Tomorrow you will come to the restaurant, but you will not wear the uniform. You will sit with me. Amina looked from the envelope to the man who had just dismantled her entire life with a checkbook. The bridge between their worlds had been built, and as the car began to move toward her apartment, she realized she had no choice but to cross it. The following morning, the restaurant felt less like a place of business and more like a tomb. When Amina arrived, she wasn't met with Sung-ho's bark or the frantic clatter of silverware. Instead, a heavy, suffocating reverence followed her every step. Yuna, who had previously treated Amina with a dismissive coldness, now stepped aside in the narrow hallway. Her head bowed so low she was nearly doubled over. Even Min-jae, the senior waiter who usually kept to his own section, scrambled to open the supply closet for her as if she were a visiting dignitary. It was a new kind of isolation. The invisible girl was gone, replaced by a ghost story. To the staff, Amina wasn't their peer anymore. She was a walking trigger for Taesung's wrath. I can do that myself, Min-jae, Amina said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. It's no trouble, Miss Johnson, Min-jae stammered, his eyes darting to the security cameras as if Taesung were watching through the lens. We didn't know about your situation. We hope you can forgive the previous, misunderstandings. Amina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the walk-in freezer. This was the collateral damage of Taesung's shadow. By solving her debt, he had stripped her of her normalcy. She was no longer a worker. She was a liability draped in silk. The shift in the room's gravity reached a breaking point an hour before the dinner service began. A man in a rumpled beige trench coat entered through the front, ignoring the closed sign. He didn't have the polished lethality of Taesung's men. He had the tired, sharp-eyed look of the law. Detective Daniel Park didn't wait for a host. He walked straight to the bar where Amina was polishing glasses and flashed a gold shield. Amina Johnson. I'm with the Seoul Metropolitan Police. Amina didn't flinch, but her grip on the glass tightened. How can I help you, detective? I'm curious about a car, he said, leaning against the bar. A black sedan belonging to a local predatory lender was found abandoned near your apartment last night. Curiously, the men inside were in no condition to drive it. And even more curiously, witnesses saw you getting into a limousine owned by a holding company tied to Choi Tae-sung. The detective leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. People like Tae-sung don't give rides for free, Amina. They don't pay off Louisiana debts out of the goodness of their hearts. Whatever he's promised you, it's a cage. Do you want to tell me what he's holding over you before you become a permanent part of his crime scene? Amina looked at the detective, then at the staff watching from the shadows. She realized the trap was closing. If she spoke, she betrayed the man who had saved her family. If she stayed silent, she was no longer just a waitress. She was an accomplice. The detective's departure left a silence far more corrosive than his questions. Amina stood behind the bar, the weight of the crystal glass in her hand feeling like a shard of ice. Across the room, Yuna and Min-jae were busy with chores, but their movements were stiff, their eyes never once drifting toward her. The barrier between her and her colleagues wasn't just made of fear anymore. It was made of glass. She was visible, yes, but she was encased, separated from the world of ordinary people by the shadow of a man who dealt in blood and loyalty. That evening, when Tae-sung arrived, the air in the restaurant didn't just still, it froze. He walked straight to her, his presence a dark gravitational pull that forced everyone else to the periphery. He didn't ask for a table. He didn't ask for tea. He simply stood before her, his unreadable eyes scanning her face for the damage the detective might have left behind. He was here, Taesung said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of a predator sensing a breach in his territory. He thinks I'm a victim or an accomplice, Amina replied, her voice barely a whisper. She looked past him, seeing the way the other waiters drifted into the kitchen, leaving them in a vacuum of silence. Is that what I am now? A case file. Taesung stepped closer, his scent of bergamot and danger filling her senses. You are whatever you choose to be. But the world is no longer looking through you, Amina. They are looking at you because of me. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. For 24 years, her safety had been her anonymity. She was the girl who blended into the background, the worker who moved without disturbing the air. That invisibility had been her armor against the coldness of the world. But now that armor was shattered. By accepting his protection, by allowing him to see her, she had stepped onto a stage where every move was scrutinized and every mistake was fatal. She looked at his hands, strong, steady, and capable of both immense gentleness and calculated violence. To love a man like Choi Taesung was to accept a life where peace was an illusion and safety was a luxury bought with power. There was no going back to being a nobody. There was no returning to the quiet struggle of the service uniform. I spent my whole life trying not to be noticed, she said, her eyes finally meeting his, bright with a mixture of grief and resolve. And I spent mine making sure no one dared to look twice, Taesung countered, his hand hovering near hers but not touching, giving her the space to choose. Amina looked at the glass partition of the restaurant's front window, seeing her reflection overlaid against the neon lights of Seoul. She was no longer a shadow. She was a woman standing in the center of a storm, and the only person holding the wind back was the man who had caused it. The safety of being a nobody was gone, traded for a dangerous, dazzling light. The shift in the city's underworld was subtle at first, like the hush before a landslide. Taesung's rivals, the Lee Syndicate, had spent decades looking for a crack in his ironclad perimeter, searching for a vice or a lapse in judgment. They found it not in a ledger or a betrayal, but in a black and white waitress uniform. Amina was leaving her morning shift when the silence of the street turned predatory. It happened in the span of 3 heartbeats. The screech of tires, the heavy scent of burning rubber, and the cold press of a gun barrel against her temple. She didn't scream. As the van sped away, her only thought was of the teacup she had left on the counter. Half finished, a mundane piece of a life that was now officially over. In his high-rise office, Taesung stared at his phone. The image sent by the Lee Syndicate was grainy but clear. Amina tied to a wooden chair in a warehouse that smelled of salt and rot. The message was simple. Relinquish the Incheon shipping docks by midnight, or the girl becomes a ghost. Sir, if you give up the docks, the other families will see it as a bloodless surrender, his lieutenant whispered, his voice tight with alarm. Your reputation, everything we built, it will look like a house of cards. They'll all come for us if they think a single woman is your weakness. Taesung didn't move. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the lights of Seoul shimmering like cold diamonds below. He knew the rules of the game. In his world, a leader's heart was a target, and he had spent 15 years pretending he didn't have one. To choose Amina was to invite a war. To choose the empire was to preserve his legacy. He thought of the way she had looked him in the eye when everyone else looked at the floor. He thought of her quiet defiance, a strength that didn't require a gun or a title. My reputation is built on the fact that I take what I want, Taesung said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that made the glass of the window shiver. And I want her alive. But the docks. Burn the docks, Taesung interrupted, turning around with eyes that promised an era of fire. Let them have the wood and the concrete. They think they found my weakness, but they've actually found the only thing left in this world I'm willing to kill for. Tell the Lee Syndicate I'm coming for her. And tell them to pray. He had spent a lifetime building an empire, but as he reached for his coat, he realized that a kingdom without the person who truly sees you is just a very expensive cage. The choice wasn't between power and love. It was between being a king of shadows or a man who finally stepped into the light. The aftermath of the rescue had left Amina's apartment feeling smaller than usual, the air still vibrating with the echoes of sirens and the metallic scent of adrenaline. She sat on her worn sofa, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. The silence of the room was interrupted by a soft, rhythmic knock, not the aggressive pounding of the debt collectors or the authoritative rap of the police, but a tentative sound that felt almost human. When she opened the door, she didn't find the dragon of soul flanked by men in suits. Choi Tae-sung stood in the dim hallway alone. His tie was gone, the top buttons of his white shirt undone, and a dark bruise was beginning to bloom along his jawline, a physical receipt for the violence he had endured to bring her home. For the first time, the iron-controlled mask had slipped, revealing a man who looked profoundly tired. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual melodic threat. Amina stepped aside, watching as he navigated her modest living space. He looked out of place among the mismatched furniture and the framed photos of her family in Louisiana, a titan of industry and blood standing in a room that smelled of lavender and old books. He didn't sit. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers with a vulnerability that made her breath hitch. "The docs are gone," he said quietly. "And the men who took you. They will never be a threat again. But I didn't come here to talk about the war." "Then why are you here, Tae-sung?" Amina asked, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "You've dismantled your reputation for a waitress. You've put a target on your back that won't go away." Tae-sung took a step toward her, crossing the invisible line she had drawn between their worlds. "I am here because I realized that the empire I built was just a louder way of being invisible. I was surrounded by people who feared me, but no one saw me. Not until you." He reached out, his fingers grazing the back of her hand, a gesture that was a question rather than a command. "I am stepping down. I've started the process of moving my assets into legitimate holdings. Logistics, real estate, things that don't require late-night phone calls or blood on the pavement." Amina looked at him, seeing the sincerity in the way his shoulders finally dropped. "You're giving it all up." "I'm giving up the darkness," he corrected. "I want a life where I can sit at your table and not have to worry about which way the door opens. I want a future that isn't built on fear." He looked around her small apartment, then back at her. "It will take time. It won't be easy. But I want to build something honest. With you." Amina realized then that the negotiated peace wasn't about territories or rivals. It was about two people laying down their armor. She reached out, closing the small gap between them, and for the first time she wasn't just looking at the boss, she was seeing the man. The golden light of a Seoul sunset spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the restaurant, casting a warm glow over the polished mahogany and the vibrant green of the tropical plants that now decorated the space. The air no longer carried the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Instead, it smelled of jasmine tea, savory bulgogi, and the comforting scent of home. Amina walked through the dining room, her stride confident and rhythmic. She wasn't wearing the black and white service uniform anymore. Instead, she wore a tailored silk blazer that complemented the deep radiance of her skin. As she passed the bar, Yuna looked up, not with a bowed head of terror, but with a genuine bright smile. Even Min-jae, now the head captain of the floor, gave her a respectful nod of shared success. This was no longer a place of rigid discipline and cold shadows. It was Amina's vision brought to life, a bridge between cultures where every worker was seen and every guest was welcomed. At table 4, the seat was already occupied. Tae-sung sat in his usual spot, but the man who had once been carved from obsidian now looked relaxed, his iron-controlled presence softened by a peace that had taken years to cultivate. He wasn't looking at a ledger or a phone. He was watching Amina with a pride so profound it was visible to everyone in the room. He had kept his promise. The dragon had stepped into the light, transitioning his vast resources into the very logistics company that now helped Amina's restaurant group expand across the city. Amina reached the table and, out of habit, set a porcelain cup of omija tea before him. She didn't stand behind his back. She sat down in the chair opposite him, the chair that had once been reserved for terrified associates and doomed rivals. "The expansion in Busan is finalized," she said, her voice rich with the satisfaction of a woman who had built her own empire. Taesung reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His grip was steady, no longer a claim of ownership, but a gesture of partnership. "I never doubted you," he whispered. "You were the only person in this city brave enough to look at me, Amina. It's only right that the city now looks at you." In the background, the soft murmur of laughter and the clinking of silverware filled the room. The restaurant was full, and for the first time in its history, the staff weren't holding their breath. They were thriving. Amina looked around at the world they had built together, a world where she was no longer the invisible girl hiding a bruise or a debt. She was a woman who was loved, respected, and finally truly home. "You're late for dinner," she teased, her eyes sparkling with a light that had nothing to do with the sunset. Taesung smiled, a rare, genuine expression that reached his eyes. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." In the heart of a city that once made her feel like a shadow, Amina Johnson Choi had become the sun. And as they sat together, two worlds finally fused into one. She realized that the greatest power wasn't in being feared, but in being seen.